right. Brother G.A. texted me yesterday and said that he and Jean aren't going to be able to be here today. So keep praying for them. You are divisive. You are distracted. You are immature. And you are sinful. Those really aren't nice things to say to someone. But those are the things, among others, that Paul said to the church in Corinth. They had sexual sin. Just take some time, if you haven't done it before, take some time and read through 1 Corinthians. And you'll see all of these problems they had. The sexual sin. The problems that they've had with idolatry and foods offered to idol, for selfishness, taking one another to court. So many issues that they had there. And it's in the midst of this that Paul writes what he writes for us in our text today in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This is not a church that was trying to do as we've been saying we want to do, and we have our list of the 5 of getting out of God's way. Our goal here in Wenatchee is to get out of God's way so we can reach the least, the last, and the lost. Amen. So we can reach, and of course there wasn't any D-church then. There wasn't any people who had gone to church, who had a relationship with God, who no longer did, really. There weren't very many if there were, but there are in Wenatchee. There are people who have made a commitment to God, but looking at their lives, you wouldn't be able to tell at all. So our goal is to reach 500 of those people, and 500 isn't any specific number. It's not because it's just 500 or because we want to be the biggest game in town. It's because we want to reach those people, and that seems like a reasonable goal. If we reach 12 people this year, then 24 the next year, so we can build our momentum like a snowball going down a hill, 48 the next year, 96, and then 192, and then we keep on going from that until it exponentially reaches more people than are in Wenatchee, and then at some point in that time period, we become a sending church, so we send other people to other places within the states or within the world, and we try to win souls elsewhere for Jesus. The gospel has gone throughout all the world, but we want to fill in some of those gaps. And we want to re-engage some people who haven't been engaged. This isn't a church who's doing those things. And Paul had 3 different methods, 3 different things that he was doing here in order to try to address these issues. The sin, the lack of focus, the selfishness, all of these different things that were going on there. And you can see there's all sorts of issues there. This isn't like the Thessalonian church where he's saying, all these good things, your labor of love and your work of faith and your steadfastness of hope. It's not like that. He just begins laying into them in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 10, like we read last week, about their divisiveness and their quarrelings and their confusion and all of these different things that they were doing. And he continues doing that all the way to the end of the book. It's not like that. He's saying there's all these different issues, and he had 3 different ways that he was addressing it. Number 1, he was confronting it. That is, he didn't mince any words about it. You have sin. You need to cast this person out. You need to call this sin out. You need to say this is not right. This is wrong. You need to live a different way. This is not in line with what God wants for you. Then he coached them or educated them. I went with C's on this. He educated them, but I like to say coach if you want to challenge yourself to that. And that's number 3. It's coach. And he confronted it. He educated them about it. He told them about the right way. This is the proper way. This is how one ought to live. This is the truth of the gospel. This is the truth of Jesus. And then he challenged them. Or he corrected them. He told them, this is the right way. See, this is the way that you are living, and I'm going to tell you that some of these things are wrong, and this is what you ought to do. And that's where we see our chapter today in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 kind of goes without saying, is smashed right in between 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and chapter 14, naturally, right? There are some places they skip over 13, don't they? You go on the elevator and it goes straight from from floor 12 to floor 14. Nobody wants to be on the 13th floor. But here we do have a chapter 13, and it is a well-known chapter. It's a chapter that we know pretty well. Whenever we read it here in just one moment, you'll recognize it. But chapter 13 is smashed right in between chapter 12 and chapter 14. And the reason that's important is chapter 12 and chapter 14 are both about spiritual gifts. It's kind of like a sandwich here. You have the bread on the outside, which can be tasty, right? But you really want that good stuff on the inside. And he addresses all the problems they have with all of the spiritual gifts, all of the ones that were saying that they were better than the others because they had this gift over that gift, or they had more powerful gifts, or whatever it is. He says that's not really what you ought to be thinking about. He says at the end of chapter 12, I will show you a way that is beyond comparison in the NET that I'm reading from. I'm going to show you a better way. This is the more excellent way, is what we see in chapter 13, right? So you have these spiritual gifts here because this is something that's important to them. 2 chapters, chapter 12, chapter 14, a really long chapter there in chapter 14. If you look in my Bible, chapter 13 is just one little paragraph right here. And chapter 14 goes all the way to the other page and into the next page. Chapter 12 is a pretty long chapter as well. All of these words about spiritual gifts, and then just this little paragraph about the application of it. Why so many words about spiritual gifts? Because that was important to them. That was their point of pride. They took pride in their spiritual gifts. They were proud that they had the gifts of tongues and the gifts of prophecy and so on. All of these gifts that he mentions there, they were very proud of it, almost to a fault, you see. So spiritual gifts isn't really the thing that we are proud of here in King's Orchard. I'm not saying that we aren't gifted, and there's more than one way to be gifted, but when we think about spiritual gifts, when we think about tongues or prophecies or some of these things, these gifts of healing, that's not what you associate King's Orchard with. What would be our point of pride? What would be the thing that's important to us? Would it be our doctrine? Would it be our history? In the churches of Christ, we come out of the Second Great Awakening in America. You have Alexander Campbell and Thomas Campbell and Barton Stone and all these other individuals who see all the problems and the disunity in churches, and they say we need to have unity, so let's try to have unity under the banner of the Bible and doing things Bible ways, right? And of course we know that there's still a lot of disunity. That didn't really work entirely, but we have a heritage of being people who know the Bible, being people who love the Bible, being people who focus on the Bible, being people who give book, chapter, and verse for the reason that we do things. Is it our heritage? And it's not just the Second Great Awakening. Historically, we can look previous to that, and for centuries before that, all the way back to early church, you can see there were individuals who called themselves the Church of Christ, who worshiped without musical instruments, who took the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, who did certain things, same things that we do. You see? So do we take pride in that? What about our building? Do we take pride in our building? There's a lot of people in our community who love our building. They appreciate it. The Scouts, the Red Cross, the homeschool co-ops. I've been working a little bit with the homeschool co-op on Monday. And one of them told me that if this new thing that we're doing with Garden City Academy doesn't work out, just let them know they'll come back just like that. The place that they're going to from here is a much smaller facility, and they're not even allowed to use the auditorium, so they're going to have to cut the numbers. They can't have quite as many people in there Monday. It's going to be on Tuesday now. They can't have quite as many people in their homeschool co-op, and they're going to have to shuffle and have 2 different assemblies instead of one assembly, all of us together, which I've been coming in here on Monday morning and doing a little devotional and singing the songs for them and stuff like that. Instead of having one big assembly, they're going to have 2 assemblies, you see? Because our building is large and it's a really wonderful space, and we let them use it and have access to a lot of different areas of it. Do we take pride in our building? I think there is something to be proud of here. People have put a lot of effort into this over the years, haven't they? Some of you, even in this room, have given lots of money and talent and time and skills into making this building a great place. It needs a little bit of maintenance now, and we've seen that over the years. The way a building works is there's things that happen that you have to replace and you have to repair and so on and so forth. But could we be proud of our building? What would Paul say to us? I think he would say the same thing that he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 to them. They're proud of their spiritual gifts. They're proud of their wealth in Jesus and the ability they have to serve and the endowment of the Spirit to let them do some miraculous things. And we're proud of what God has done for us in order to give us this space to use for our community and to use for our own purposes as well, to use for the cause of Christ. So what would he say? All you need is love. Love. It's the answer to Corinth's problem. It's the answer to our problem. Read with me just the first few verses. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but I do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophecy and I know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so that I can remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away everything I own, and if I give over my body in order to boast, but do not have love, I receive no benefit. Love is patient. Love is kind. It's not envious. Love does not brag. It's not puffed up. It's not rude. It's not self-serving. It's not easily angered or resentful. It's not glad about injustice, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But if there are prophecies, they will be set aside. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be set aside. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when what is perfect come, the partial will be set aside. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became an adult, when I became a man, I set aside childish ways. For now we see in a mirror indirectly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I have been fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And read the first verse in chapter 14, at least the first couple of words. Pursue love. Isn't that interesting? There's 3 easy points here. If you want to divide the chapter out, this one's an easy one to do. The first one, it's in paragraphs even in my Bible already. Verses 1 through 3. Verses 1 through 3 is suggesting that love is the most important thing. It's more important than the tongues of men and of angels. Okay, so you can speak in tongues. You can speak in the tongues of men. You can speak in the tongues of angels. But if you don't have love, then you're just a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. A gong and a cymbal, they can be very helpful in an orchestra. They're very powerful. Da-na-na-na-na-na-na-na, boom! Right? You love the gong. We love the gongs. Children love the gongs and the cymbals. Whang! But after that first one, then you want to take them away from the child. Right? Huh? Right? You don't. If you have all those things, then you're just an annoyance. That's all you are. You're just making noise. If you have all prophecy, remember the context in chapter 12 and chapter 14 are both about spiritual gifts. The thing they took pride in, the thing they were proud of, the thing that was important to them. And he says, that's not the most important thing. It's fascinating to me, and I mentioned to somebody in this room earlier in the week, I was going to be preaching on the love chapter. And they said, oh, that was in our wedding. It's pretty common in weddings, isn't it? Right? But what you have at a wedding is a celebration of love that is already present. You don't have two people who are angry at one another, and then you get them together and you try to marry them and read the love chapter. If I were doing premarital counseling with that couple, I would say, eesh, that's either wait. You know what my goal in premarital counseling is, in some ways, is to convince them not to get married. You know why? If I can convince you not to get married, maybe you don't need to be married. Right? If I can convince you not to become a believer, maybe you don't need to be a believer. Because your love for Jesus, your knowledge of your sin and your failure and your ineptitude should be so vast and so big that you say, I don't care what you say, I'm going to come to Jesus because He's the only one who can save me. And if I say to you, maybe you don't need to get married, you're going to say, listen, preacher, we're going to get married. And if you don't do it, then I'm going to find somebody else who does it. So you can come here and do your premarital counseling. We agree to that because that's what you say we have to do in order for you to marry us. So we'll do that, right? But if you're not going to marry us, we're going to find somebody who wants to. That's a good sign. For being read at a wedding, it's to celebrate love that's already there. But here, this is a challenge to them. You have all these issues, you have all these, and we mentioned them last week, you have all these divisions, you have all this quarreling, you have all this argument, you have all this, I'm of Paul and I'm of Cephas and I'm of Apollos and I'm of Christ, arguing, just backbiting. You're taking each other to court. There's sexual sin there, all this fussing. You need some love. You need some love for one another. Doesn't it make sense that love is the most important thing? What does the New Testament say? You know these. Love covers a multitude of, right? Is love important? Does prophecies cover a multitude of sins? Do tongues? Do buildings? Does doctrine? Hey, I think we should be proud of doctrine. I love doctrine. I think that teaching and understanding the Bible, I am in some ways a professional Christian, right? I get to proclaim, I get to study the Bible, and it is a gift that I get to open it and research and think and pray for you and pray with you and be a part of your lives. It is a wonderful thing, and I care about doctrine. I have certain things that I think we should practice and certain things that I think we should not practice. But way more important than some of those practices and way more important than some doctrine is love. The most important thing. Doesn't it make sense that that's the most important thing? The New Testament says about God what? That God is doctrine. No, it doesn't. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because that's not true. God is love. I should have, Derek, had you sing this one. Love one another, for love is of God. He who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Amen. Not only is God love, love is of God. Does that make sense? I suggest to you, not only, and we're going to say this, I'm kind of robbing myself of some of my the things I want to say later, but we'll say it again then too, all right? When love exists, even in unbelievers, I believe that's from the Spirit, and that's from God. Love is from God. Love is of God. Does God only have to... The world is full of God. There is no one who has ever been alive who has been completely outside of the presence of God. No one. No human. Because God is here. He is omnipresent. He's everywhere. God had to create a space that we call hell in order to make a space where He wouldn't be. Because God respects our free will, and we say to God, I don't want to have anything to do with you, and He says, okay, this space is for you. And that place is described as a place where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth because there is no presence of God. All of the good things in the world, everything that is good, comes from God. Love comes from God, even whenever it's not in a believer's heart. So it makes sense that love is the most important thing. They'll know we are Christians by our doctrine. Because of our building, because of our spiritual gifts. Or they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. They'll know we are Christians by our love. All the law and the prophets summed up in one word. Love. Love your neighbor and love God. It's the most important thing. If I have prophecy, if I know all mysteries and all knowledge, I have all this divine knowledge, but if I don't have, and I have all faith so much that I can tell this mountain over here, be lifted up and cast into the sea. If I have that much faith, but I don't have love, I am nothing. If I give everything I own, all those spiritual gifts, but the New Testament in the book of Romans says that giving is a spiritual gift as well. If I give everything that I have, if I give my body in order to boast, there's a little textual variant there about boast or burning. We don't want to get into it too much. But if I give my body in order to boast, if I give my body in place of another, I become a slave so this person can be free. I go to prison so this person can be brought out of prison. I work my fingers to the bone so I can purchase this person from slavery, so I can pay for this person's issues and help this person in whatever it is. If I have all of these acts and all of this ministry, everything I have, I give my body in order to boast, but do not love, I do not have love, I receive no benefit. The most important thing. But then he goes on. He says, not only is it the most important thing, paragraph 1, paragraph 2, love is patient, love is kind, it's not envious, and so on. Love behaves a certain way. Love does certain things. Now, I like grammar. I didn't always like grammar. I try to use an adverb whenever it is I am doing well, not I'm doing good, right? Superman does good, you're doing well. You see, there's a difference. I'm good. No, I'm well. You see, there's a little difference. I don't want to get too bogged down in grammar for you, but here's a simple one that we learned early on if we went to public school. I don't know if my kids know the difference really very well because they're homeschooled. Anyway, there is an adjective and there is a verb. An adjective is what? It's something that describes something else. But a verb, according to Schoolhouse Rock, is does. It does, right? You got different types of verbs too, obviously. You got your being verbs, and is, are, was, were, be, being, been, right? Remember, do you have to learn those too? You know, you got your passive verbs and your active verbs, and you got your verbs of agency and so on. You got all these different types of verbs. But here, it's important to understand this. Listen, I know I'm losing you on this grammar talk, all right? It's important to realize that these words here that describe love are all verbs in the original language. It says in our translation, love is patient, love is kind. That is an adjective, the way it's translated there, but it's not. Here's a better one. Love bears up under provocation. Do you see the difference? Love is boots on the ground. Love is active. It's not just some passive thing. It's what you do. Love bears up under provocation. It's not just patient. Love patiently waits, you might be able to say, but the verb is defined in the lexicons as a little bit. So we have the same thing in English, right? You can define a word. They're called, if you have one word, it's called a gloss. It's a gloss. You gloss that word. Like synonyms and thesaurus and stuff like that. You know, you have glosses, but then you have definitions, and that always takes more than one word. And if you define this word that's here, love bears up under provocation. Love, instead of is kind, provides something beneficial as an act of kindness. Love isn't just, oh, I'm kind whenever it just happens. It provides, it gives, it does something as an act of kindness. Do you see? Love does not have intense negative feelings over another person's success or envious. Love does not heap praise on oneself. Love does not have an exaggerated self-conception. Love's not puffed up. Love does not behave disgracefully or dishonorably or indecently, or love is not rude. Love does not strive for one's own advantage. Love does not become provoked, irritated, or angry. The NET translates this, love is not easily angered. But you know something? That word easily isn't there. This word, this anger word here, is only used 2 times in the New Testament. It's used here, and it's used of Paul over in Acts 17, I think about verse 6. And it says of Paul there that he is angry. But I think the suggestion here is that love does not get angry at unimportant things. You know the thing that Paul got angry at there? All of the idols that were around in Mars Hill in the Areopagus. He sees all these idols to worship, these gods that aren't Jehovah God, that aren't the Creator, that aren't the unmoved mover, that aren't this God that we worship that is the only God of His kind. Maybe there are other gods. Maybe there are other powerful beings out there. But there is no God like Jehovah. He is the only one who was there in the beginning. He created the universe. Do you see? He created heaven and filled it with angels and spiritual beings. He created the earth and He filled it with people and humans and plants. That's what God does. He creates a space and He fills it. You see? That's what He does. He created it. He is the only God of His kind. So when Paul gets angry there, he's angry that there are these other things that people are worshiping, these other beings, these other, sometimes nothing, these fantasies it could be. You see? But here he says that love doesn't get angry. Well, what does he mean there? Well, love doesn't get angry at his brother over a spiritual gift that they have that you don't have. Or love doesn't get angry at this other group over here of believers that think differently than we are. Love doesn't get angry at even an enemy. What does the Bible say? What does Jesus say? He says, love your enemies. Right? Pray for those who persecute you. Love does not take into account wrongdoings or resentful. Love does not or is not glad about wickedness or unrighteousness or injustice. These last 2 are pretty good. Love rejoices in truth. Do you see? Do you see how it's active, how it always does something? That it behaves a certain way? And again, the context is this thing that's really important to them. So whenever there's something that's important to you, that somebody is doing something that you don't agree with, that you don't like, or that you feel is wrong, how do you behave toward them? Do you call them a cancer on the church here? Do you refuse to talk to them whenever they ask to mention things and discuss something with you? Or do you love them? Do you care about them? Jesus, when He was asked, how many times do I forgive a brother if they come to me? You know what He says? 70 times 7. Every single time, basically, someone asks you in one day, that was the question. Say a brother comes to me in a day, and if 3 times in one day, and I forgive him, am I doing all right? No, that's not enough. 70 times 7 times. In one day, people, that's a lot. I don't think I could, slight somebody 490 times unless I was purposefully doing it. You see? And you forgive them. That doesn't say you don't remember those things. We don't even have the ability to forget those things. God does. He forgets it. So you pray for something that you've asked for forgiveness for from 20 years ago, and you pray to God about it, and He's like, what's this person talking about? You don't even know. Because God He is divine. He is capable of forgetting when we can't. We remember those things, but we can't let it have this root of bitterness inside of us. You see? And then one more paragraph. Love never ends. Love never ends. Love, if you're writing this down, number 1, it is the most important thing. Number 2, it behaves a certain way. And number 3, love is eternal. It's eternal. Well, listen to some of the things that he says here. If there are prophecies, they will be set aside. Are prophecies eternal? Nope. And this is what's important to them. If there are tongues, they will cease. Are tongues eternal? If there is knowledge, it will be set aside. Or is supernatural knowledge, is that eternal? For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect comes, the partial will be set aside. Spiritual gifts aren't eternal. Things that seem important to us aren't eternal. Do you see? Does it make sense? We can't let the things that happen that we think are important, we can't let that bother us. Sin should bother us. Sin determines someone's eternal destination. Jude says that some people we pluck from the fire. Jesus, whenever he went in and he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead there, it's like a warlike term, like a horse stomping into battle before he goes in there. He's angry. He's weeping about Lazarus. Why? Maybe because he's about to bring him back, maybe because of death. But he's fighting against death there, you see. Jesus, he did get angry whenever he turned the money changers, the tables of the money changers over. Ephesians 4 verse 26 says, "Be angry and do not sin. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath." Some things aren't eternal. Spiritual gifts aren't. Tongues aren't. We know in part, verse 9, we prophesy in part, but when what is perfect comes, the partial will be set aside. There's some discussion about that, even in the churches of Christ, about miraculous gifts and things like that, about how there's a cessationist view and there's the continuationist view. I don't think that's really what Paul's talking about here, right? He's trying to set the stage and tell them what is important. He's not trying to tell them about when miraculous gifts will cease, whether it's the closing of the canon, the maturity level of this church, or when Jesus comes back. It's not really the whole point there. And we can't escape that. We got to see what the thrust is that he's saying. The thrust is that here are these spiritual gifts that you're fussing over, but you're missing the point, because the point of all those things is love. Because love is eternal. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. For this culture, children were not important at all. Throwaway. That's why it was so huge when Jesus said, "Allow the children to come to me." Right? Don't just allow them. Let them come to me. And you've got to come to me as a little child. Right? It was crazy. But he says that this is the immaturity part of it, these prophecies. This is the beginning phases of it. This is just the tool. This is, and you're fussing over these things. Don't. That's childish. Because whenever you become a man, whenever you become an adult, you set aside those things. It's different. The things my kids fuss over, I wouldn't dream of fussing over. It's crazy. That's childish. And it's important to them, and I understand that, and I try to have patience, try. But that's what you're dealing with now with some of these things. Love is the only thing that's eternal. See? A time is coming when things are perfect and clear and mature. These three remain, he says: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And pursue love, he says. Let's do something a little different that I don't ordinarily do. I like to spend my time in one text. I might bring a couple in here and there, but I really like to spend time in one text. And I think that's very valuable, because the whole point, we've got to understand what the original intent of the author was. We're having a little mess up with this today. I had them all on the screen ready for you so you could read, but you're going to have to be like cavemen and use your print Bible. Okay? So I'm going to give you where you need to turn, and you turn there and you read with me. 1 John chapter 3. And I want us to ask a couple of questions. The question I want us to ask is, what happens? What happens when you have love in your life? According to 1 John chapter 3, beginning in verse 16. Just listen to what John writes. John is known as the love apostle. Right? Love one another. He says it so many times. They say that some of his last words were children as he's being carried. He's the only one who wasn't martyred. As he's being carried, he says, children, beloved, love one another. Because it's so important. It's the most important thing, is what Paul writes. And he's writing this. This is the key to all of their problems. All of their problems. If you stop whenever you get angry, if you stop whenever you think about a problem, and you look at this person as a person who God made, and who God loves, God formed, but this person may be broken in one way, then it will change your outlook. There have been people, even in this place, who have been rude and crude and completely unchristian to me. Yeah, I'm not trying to be woe is me about that. But you know what? Maybe you think that I'm that way, first off. All right, maybe you think that I'm not very nice, that I come in here and I shake things up and I tell you we need to change the order of services and we have to, move this contribution box and we're going to use these chalices and instead of passing the trays or whatever. Maybe you think that I'm a horrible human being. Maybe you think that. You have the right to think that. All right, you have that right. But here's the solution. For me, whenever you treat me poorly, and for you, whenever you think that I'm treating you poorly, love me. God loves me. Every single human being who ever lived has been made in the image of God. That includes you and the person who hurt me, and me and the person who hurts you. 1 John 3, what happens when you have love? Verse 16, we have come to know love by this, that Jesus laid down his life for us. Thus, we ought to lay down our lives for our fellow Christians. But whoever has the world's possessions and sees his fellow Christian in need and shuts off his compassion against him, how can the love of God reside in such a person? Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. And by this we will know that we are of the truth and will convince our conscience in his presence. Love is active. Love does something. Whenever you see someone who has a need and you don't do anything, that's not love. If you want to see love personified, look at Jesus. That's what Paul was thinking of. That's who Paul was thinking of when he wrote the love chapter. He came to heaven. He came from heaven to earth to show the way. He went from the earth to the cross, my sins to pay. From the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. Right? Why did he do that? God so loved the world. You, me, even his creation, I believe, that he gave his only son, the one-of-a-kind son. There's no other son like Jesus. That's love. That's love. God didn't send his son in the world or condemn the world, but that the world could be saved through him. It's always going to result in something. How about another one? John 14 and verse 15. Just one verse here. Jesus says, he says before this, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you so that where I am, you can also be. And then just a little bit later, he says this, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. What happens when God's love resides in you? According to 1 John 3, 16 and 19, action, never inaction. It always results in doing something. And that action is number one toward God. You see? That doesn't say you're not going to mess up. That's not going to say you're not going to get it wrong. I have changed my theories and my beliefs on doctrine a few times. I was either wrong then and I'm right now. I was right then and I'm wrong now. Or I was wrong then and I'm wrong now. I need the grace of God when it comes to my doctrine. I need the grace of God when it comes to worship practices, when it comes to how I serve you. It may turn out in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years that I was the reason that everything went south in this church. So, it may be. It may end up being that way. You look back and you come back in 10 and 15, 20 years and you say, where did we go wrong? Oh, Daniel. It may be. I'm not trying to belittle myself here. I'm saying that because I'm doing the best I can. I'm doing what I think is right. I'm doing what I studied. I'm doing where I feel like God is leading us. I'm doing what seems to make the most sense. But if I'm doing it wrong, you know what I need? It's not the motives matter. But, they say sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Motives matter. My motives are perfectly good. And I'm trying here. And I'm listening. I need grace. I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. But I'm going to do my best to obey God's commandments. Why? Because I feel like I'm going to earn my salvation? No, because I need God and I love Him. How about another one? Romans 13, verses 8 to 10. Just a couple more. I know this isn't normal. This isn't what I like to do. I like to explain the context of what's going on here, but let's just take a couple snippets, please, and then the lesson's going to be yours. Romans 13, beginning in verse 8. This is just after he says, pay everyone, in verse 7, what is owed, taxes, to whom taxes are due. If you owe money to someone, you had somebody do work on your house, pay them. You had somebody who, you had them do this, pay them, right? The government says you owe them money, even if you don't like the way they spend it. They send it to Ukraine, and they spend it on abortions, and they spend it on this, and they spend it on that. Pay the government. Rome was doing some awful things with the money at that time. What did Christians do? They paid their taxes. So we pay our taxes. We live in a little bit of a different world where we can protest. That's okay. We live in a little different world where we can cast our vote. That's okay. That's good. I love the things that we can do in America. That's great. There's a lot of blessings here, right? But at the end of the day, you pay what you owe. And then he says, the only thing that you owe anyone, owe no one anything except to love one another in Romans 13. So any debt you have, you pay it, but the debt you can never pay is loving one another. What happens when you have the love of God? It's going to result in action according to 1 John 3, 16 through 19. It's going to result in action toward God, John 14 and verse 15, and it's going to result in action toward your neighbors, Romans 13, beginning in verse 8. The one who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law, for the commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet. And if there is any other commandment, are summed up in this: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. You don't treat people poorly. You don't do it. It is a sin. And it needs to be called out when people treat other people poorly in this body. We're brothers and sisters. And even to our neighbors, we don't treat people poorly. We don't come in to the city office whenever we're asking for a permit to do something here and grunt and huff and complain. And, why do y'all do this? I gotta pay this. You don't sit there at that door and say to someone, I can't believe that you did this and you're a horrible person because of what you wore to church today, or because of this, or because of that. Huh? Crazy. It's insane. You don't do that. It always results in action toward God and then toward your neighbor. You can never pay that debt. That's the only thing you owe anyone, is what he says there. Okay, John 15 and verse 13, just a few more. John 15 and verse 13. No one, my commandment, he says in verse 12, is this: to love one another just as I have loved you. No one, verse 13, has greater love than this, than one lays down his life for his friends. Love is epitomized in what Jesus did. Maybe we're doing it the wrong way when we tell people what God will do for them when they're saved. It's what Jesus has already done. Jesus has paid the price for everything you've ever done wrong, every slight that you've done for someone. And some of you might be good people. Some of these people out here in this community might be good people, but they've messed up some. Because there is no one that is perfect. No, not one, except for Jesus. And he died for you and for me. He's the epitome of what perfect love is. God's love is epitomized in Jesus. Romans 5, 7 to 10. And this characterizes it more than anything. While we were still helpless at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. That's verse 6. For rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person perhaps someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, because we have now been declared righteous by his blood, we will be saved through him from God's wrath. Verse 10. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, how much more, since we have been reconciled, will we be saved by his life? That's how much he loved us. 2 more passages, and then I'll be done. Thank you for your patience. it's worth dwelling on love. Because love, according to Paul, is the most important thing. You can't say we've got the right doctrine and we've got a great building, but we're over here and we're mean and we're whatever the opposite of love is, hateful, apathetic. Is hatred the only antonym of love? Is it hateful to just be completely indifferent towards someone? I think it can be. Are we indifferent toward our neighbors? James 3:13. Who is wise and understanding? This is what love looks like when it's what it looks like when love is not present. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct he should show his works done in the gentleness that wisdom brings. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfishness in your hearts, do not boast and tell lies against the truth. Such wisdom does not come from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where there is jealousy and selfishness, there is disorder in every evil practice. That doesn't sound like the God way to me. I told you one more, and then I'm going to give it to you. Galatians chapter 5. I initially was just going to read verse 22, but let's back up. Galatians is one of those passages as well. Whenever he says some awful things to him, almost, it seems like. He calls him, look back at chapter 3 and verse 1, you foolish Galatians. He says in chapter 1, I am astounded, I'm shocked that you were so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are following a different gospel. That's chapter 1 and verse 6. He says in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 4, you who are trying to be declared righteous by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. You're not in his grace anymore because you're trying to do it this way. Can't you fall away? Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. You were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity to indulge in your flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law can be summed up in a single commandment. Namely, you must love your neighbor as yourself. How many times are they going to say this in this book? I've already read that once, Paul. Maybe, whenever you see something repeated over and over and over again, there's something important to it. I read something the other day about there are 613 commands in the Old Testament, 248 positive and 365 negative, right? 613 commands. There's only one of them that's repeated 3 times. One of them. And it doesn't really make sense in some ways, so you can just ponder this along with me. I've been putting it back here and just sitting letting it think a little bit. You don't boil a baby goat, in its mother's milk. Think about that. That's repeated 3 times. The only one that's repeated 3 times. I don't know. Maybe that has something to do with love. It's not very loving to boil a goat in its own mother's milk. I don't know. That was just kind of a squirrel. Anyway, Galatians 5, verse 15. However, if you continually bite and devour one another, beware that you are not consumed by one another. But I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. For the flesh has desires that are opposed to the Spirit, and the Spirit has desires that are opposed to the flesh. For these are in opposition to each other, so that you cannot do what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, depravity, idolatry, sorcery, hostility, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish rivalries, dissensions, factions, envying, murder, drunkenness, carousing, and similar things. I am warning you, as I have warned you before, those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such there is no law. The fruit of the Spirit, number 1, I don't know if these are in order of importance, but number 1 is love. What's the message there? No matter how much you try by your own effort to be loving, you'll never be able to be loving on your own effort. You can't. It's from God. Am I wrong? It's the fruit of the Spirit. Love is the fruit of the Spirit. That's what Paul said. I don't know. I think Paul's right. What do you think? I can try. I'm having a fuss with my wife. I can't, she won't listen to reason. I'm trying to tell her. I'm trying to tell her that this is the way to do it. Whenever you're, cleaning, like you're supposed to be doing all the time. That's a joke. This is the way you do it. Right? You don't do it that way. And she's like, well, why don't you get over here and do it then? Hey, he's up there. We have a fuss. All right? That didn't happen. Just so you know, I try to help. I don't do as good a job as she does. She's better at certain things, and I'm better at certain things. We each have our abilities. Anyway, if I don't have love for my wife, I can't force it. You can't. If I don't have love for God, I can't force it. If I don't have love for my neighbors, I can't force it. So the question is, how can we open ourselves up to receive God's love from His Spirit? How can we make ourselves open toward it and cultivate the ground of our heart to receive the seed of God's Spirit and His love and the joy and the peace and the patience and the kindness and the goodness and so on? What do we do? 4 different things that I suggest to you. And then I've got to get back there because she's losing the ideas, apparently. She needs her daddy. Number 1, obey. Do what God has told you to do. Try it. Just try it. And I don't think that's going to do it, because he says in 1 Corinthians 13, if you do all these things and you don't have love, it's worthless, right? So, but you do those things to create a pattern and to see the benefit in your life. And when you do that, then that's going to cultivate the ground for God's love in your life. Number 2, read and study the Scripture. Open up your Bible and read and see what God has done. You can meditate in your life about what God has done in your life. Look at those things. Number 3, I think this is important. Be a part of a local church and be here regularly. I think that's important. Church don't save you. You're not saved by church. But if you aren't a part of it, it's like, I take it like you're trying to use your fingers to pull a screw out of the wall. Like sometimes you can't do it at all, it seems like. Maybe you can if you tried it, if your life depended on it. You bleed, your nails are all done in, instead of using a screwdriver. Church is the tool that helps you take that out of the wall. Be a part of a church. And then number 4, and I think this is important, ask God for it in prayer. Ask God for His Spirit. Ask God to make you more loving. Ask God to help you look at your wife or your children or your enemies in a different way. Beg Him. And don't stop. The kids asked me the other day what my favorite passage in Scripture is. You know what it is? That persistent widow. I don't fear God, and I don't fear man, and I don't care anything about this widow, but she is annoying me, so I'm going to give her what she's asking for, is what the judge said. And if that judge will do that, how much more will God give you what you need if He loves you? Beg Him. Here's what, what's his name? Jonathan Edwards. He said, when you get the full measure of God's love, it will produce all proper behavior toward God and man. Love will produce all proper behavior toward God and man. And if I had it on the screen here, you'd see our list of 5 things that will help us get out of God's way. Prayer, worship, a service to guests, working and giving, and trust and unity. Love will help you get out of God's way. It's on that list. That's what all those things are about. Love will help us reach the 500 least and last and lost, de-church, unchurched people in this community. If we love them. So think we can do it from memory. Let's stand and pray our prayer. God, grow our faith in number. Let us serve Wenatchee in the world. Be seated.